Well, greetings once again from Cooperstown, New York. It is a beautiful sunny fall day here at the site of the National Baseball Hall of Fame and Museum. We're very glad that all of you could join us for our latest virtual program, and it's our final virtual author series of 2023. We're very glad to have with us Steve Gietschier, longtime editor for the Sporting News, great researcher, an award winner, and the author of a terrific new book, which has been receiving tremendously strong reviews. It is called Baseball, the Turbulent Mid-Century Years. You can see the cover photograph on the right-hand side of your screen, and the book is available from the University of Nebraska Press. Let me give you some background information before we have Steve come on. Steve is an acclaimed historian and researcher. He worked as a managing editor at the Sporting News, my favorite baseball-related publication. He was there from 1986 through 2008. He also has worked in the past as a university curator and associate professor of history at Lindenwood University. I did not know about that until preparing for this. He has written several books, including the book we'll be talking about today, The Turbulent Mid-Century Years. Steve, welcome to the program. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Bruce, for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to talk to you and to all the people who have tuned in. I appreciate it.
Steve, before we begin to talk about this great book you've done, I want to discuss this recent award that you won from the Society for American Baseball Research. It is the Henry Chadwick Award. The Chadwick Award was established back in 2009. It honors baseball's great researchers. This would include historians, statisticians, archivists, for their invaluable contributions to baseball and the appreciation of its history. The award is really the top of the line. This is about as good as it gets for anybody who is connected with the Society for American Baseball Research. I believe the award came down back in February. Did you have any idea that you were being considered for this?
No, none whatsoever. I was, as a matter of fact, I was part of the committee that established the award back in 2009 and laid out the criteria, but I really didn't think that I would ever be a winner of it because, like you, I worked for an institution, and it's really hard to separate whatever I did from whatever support that the company gave to the effort. Most of the early winners were individuals rewarded for their own contributions. So when the announcement came in February, it was a great surprise, very great.
So who called you and gave you the good news?
I believe it was the CEO of SABR, Scott Bush. Mm-hmm.
And when you got that call, did you kind of feel like you'd made the Hall of Fame?
Well, yeah, I guess so. It's a wonderful award. It's nice to be acknowledged. I spent 22 years at the Sporting News. We were able to create the research center, create the archives, bring some order to what had been chaos, and then within a couple of years, open the facility like the Hall of Fame Research Library, open to the facility to outsiders.
Yeah.
So our names are not on the cover of very many books, but we're in the acknowledgments of many books, and I really appreciate that, and I think that's why I was considered for the Chatty, as it's called.
I'm not as familiar with the Chadwick as I probably should be. Do they have a ceremony that goes along with it?
The award itself, a nice piece of crystal, is presented at the awards luncheon at the annual convention. So we had we had our convention.
You went to that?
Yeah, I was there. We had the luncheon. The keynote speaker at the luncheon was Jason Benetti, who gave, as you might expect, a terrific speech. And then I had to get up after him. Well,
interesting. Jason Benetti just hired by the Tigers as their play-by-play announcer. Well, that's great. Congratulations from everyone here at the Hall of Fame. We've had one of our staff people win the Chadwick, Tom Schieber. You know Tom very well. He's also from St. Louis, where you live. So you and Tom are an elite company.
Thank you very much.
Well, the book that you have written is quite extensive and extremely well done. It is over 550 pages. including endnotes and an index. To say the least, this must have been a lengthy endeavor. I often talk to writers. They'll tell me they've been working on a book for maybe a year, 2 years, 3 years. This must have taken what, the better part of a decade?
I'm embarrassed to answer questions like this because this book took more than 20 years.
Wow.
I hatched the idea in 2000, and actually I came up with the idea for a book like this without really thinking that I might be its author. There was it's a bit of an involved story, but Sabre used to present the Seymour Medal. Bruce, you know this because you won the Seymour Medal. Sabre used to present the Seymour Medal at a conference all its own, the Seymour Medal Conference. And in 2000, that conference was held in Cleveland. Bill Marshall won the award for his book, The Pivotal Era. And one of the sessions at the conference was a panel discussion about the future of baseball research. Where were we going? I was on that panel as an employee of the Sporting News. Someone from the Hall of Fame was there. I think it must have been Tim Wiles. Someone from Western Reserve Historical Society, and Dorothy Seymour Mills, who I did not know at the time. We obviously talked about the 2 or 3 Seymour books that had been published. And in the course of that panel discussion, I asked Mrs. Mills, I later got to call her Dorothy, but in 2000, she was Mrs. Mills. I asked her if what she would think if someone picked up the ball where she and her late husband had put it down and wrote a follow-up to baseball, the Golden Age. And she thought it would be a good idea, a great idea. And I asked around. I knew a lot of people in the baseball research and scholarly community. And I asked a whole bunch of folks, you want to write this book? You want to write this book? And everybody gave 2 answers. No, I don't want to do it. And Steve, you should do it. I thought that was a really stupid answer. But I thought about it for a while. And at the Sabre convention that summer in Miami, I had lunch with the late Dan Ross, then the director of the University of Nebraska Press. And I asked him what he thought as a professional in the publishing business. He thought it would be a good idea. He encouraged me to submit a book proposal. And I said, sure, Dan, what's a book proposal? So we went from there. My original thought was this book would take 4 years. I kind of laid out a plan. Well, I was wrong. I forgot, I suppose, that I had a full-time job and a family to take care of. And it dragged on and on and on. But eventually we got it done. So I tell that story, but I really don't like to tell that story because it's so embarrassing. But here it is.
Well, it's interesting. So often you hear from a writer that, well, this was an idea I had since childhood. It was a dream of me to write this particular book, this theme. And here you took the suggestions of others. I think that's fascinating.
Well, it was, in many ways, it was a lot of fun. I enjoy writing. I enjoy research. And I even enjoy editing my own prose, although I find that to be very difficult. Sure. But overall, even though it took so long, it was an enjoyable project. Maybe the least enjoyable part of it was having to cut it because I wrote much more than could ever go between 2 covers.
Wow!
So we had to hack away at it at a certain point.
Stephen, putting this volume together, did you rely mostly on newspaper, magazine, print articles, or did you also conduct a number of oral history interviews too?
I didn't do any oral history interviews, but I think in terms of the research, it's a combination of 2 things: my own original research in newspapers and magazines, and relying on the published work of many Sabre members. The Seymours published their first 2 volumes in 1960 and 1971. Sabre wasn't founded until 1971. So when they were writing, they were on their own. But so many people have done so much wonderful work in the intervening, 52 years, that I was able to read and to rely on the work of others. So in a certain sense, this is a book of original research, but it's also what historians call a synthesis, bringing together the work of others on a lot of small and not so small subjects into one large piece.
I'm holding the book right here, as you can see, a pretty thick volume, a lot of great material in here. And as I mentioned a moment ago, it is complete with many endnotes and an extensive index. A lot of really good baseball books don't have indexes, and it always bothers me when that happens because it's hard to refer to certain players or certain topics. But this index certainly allows you to do that. Any reader to do that. Steve, you begin the book, the first chapter of the book, with the 1931 season. And that really leads us into the first major theme that you discuss. That's the start of the Great Depression. Baseball, like every other industry in America, was badly damaged. I mean, baseball was not immune, right?
Right. People are spending what we now call discretionary income to buy tickets to baseball games. And when the Depression hit, it became harder and harder for many people to do that. So baseball suffered. The major leagues suffered. The minor leagues suffered even more. Yes.
When did attendance at baseball games start to noticeably decline?
I think in the early 30s, 1930, 1931, 1932. By 1933, the Depression is at its lowest, and things are beginning to stabilize and then to improve a little bit with the start of the New Deal. But it certainly took a while. That is on the major league level. The minors struggled on for several more years before they began to see some improvement. There were, I think, as one scholar has argued, too many minor league teams in too many small cities, run by owners who were undercapitalized, and they just couldn't survive.
Yeah. When did players' salaries take a downturn? Was that pretty much immediate?
Yeah, immediately, sure. Of course, players, baseball's operating under the reserve clause. It's a take it or leave it proposition. Owners send out letters with a contract number. The player really has three choices: say yes, say, hey, let's talk about this, or go do something else. And when they chose the middle option, let's talk about this, they're still at a disadvantage because the owners have them under contract, and the reserve clause binds them to that club for this year and the next after that. So there's not a lot of leverage on the players' part, and they pretty much had to settle for what the owners were willing to offer them, and the owners began to offer them less and less.
Yeah. Were rosters cut down too?
Rosters, boy, that's a good question. I don't think rosters were cut down. I may be wrong about that, so don't quote me, but I don't think so. In the minors, yes. Mm-hmm. And the minor leagues instituted salary caps, not for individual players, but for the roster as a whole. And you look at the numbers, and I can't quote them right now, but the numbers for the entire monthly salary for a minor league team are just mind-bogglingly small.
Yeah.
But in the majors, the minimum salary was pretty low, and not too many people made a lot more than the minimum salary. Owners were able to tighten the screws pretty easily.
Steve, you mentioned that some minor league teams went out of business. How about entire minor leagues?
Oh, yes. Oh, absolutely. Yes, the number of minor leagues who started each season for a number of seasons in a row was always less than those that had finished the previous season. And a number of those leagues would go out of business during the season. Yeah. Now, here's the kicker, Bruce. A lot of them went out of business on July 5th. They played a doubleheader on July 4th, one more chance to get a crowd of some size, and then shut the doors on July 5th. Of course, there were leagues in which individual teams went out of business, but in certain cases, whole leagues shut down and stayed shut down for years and years. Some of them disappeared forever.
That's interesting. They treated the 4th of July almost like the peak of the season.
Yeah. You and I are both old enough to remember when Memorial Day, the 4th of July, and Labor Day were doubleheader days, in every park. Yeah.
Steve, was there ever any legitimate concern that Major League Baseball, the National American League, might go completely under or at least be suspended for a period of time?
I don't recall seeing any evidence to that effect. I think major league owners thought that they would carry on. Um, you know, part of the time they realize that they're a business. Other times they think, this is a game in which we hold in trust for the public, and there was never any plan to contract or to suspend operations for a season or two. There was talk about that during the First World War, of course,
Yeah.
and of course during the Second World War, and maybe we'll get to that later. But during the Depression, no, I think owners thought that we'll tighten our belts and we'll muddle through. And as people said in the early 30s, prosperity is just around the corner. Well, not exactly, but eventually,
Yeah.
yes.
The Negro Leagues were badly affected too.
Yes, yes. The first Negro National League went out of business after the 1931 season, and the Negro League team operations, always precarious economically, they struggled mightily.
When you look at baseball as a whole, and the established major leagues, the American and National League, did survive, who were some of the people that might have been especially responsible for the game still keeping its head above water during the early to mid 1930s?
Well, I think we have to credit Branch Rickey, maybe more than anyone else, for devising the farm system, which enabled major league clubs with a certain amount of capital to begin to fund minor league clubs and keep them in business. Now, Judge Landis, as commissioner, was opposed to farm systems. He thought that it trapped players in a system that didn't allow them to advance. And in a certain sense, that of course is true. It's still true. That's how the minors operate. But on the other hand, the major league teams were, they were supplying uniforms. They were beginning to pay players salaries. And that's what allowed minor league teams to stay in business. And the farm system was Rickey's idea. It's the way he turned the Cardinals from an also-ran into a winner when they had very little money of their own.
So Branch Rickey toward the top of the list. Anybody else that you feel should be mentioned?
Well, Frank Shaughnessy, perhaps. Larry McPhail as well. Shaughnessy was the president of the International League. He was a Canadian. He was familiar with playoffs, postseason playoffs in hockey, and he suggested that minor leagues institute playoffs as well. I mean, just like today, a playoff system is designed to keep fans interested until the very end of the regular season, and then in certain cities to attend more games. Let's not just have a regular season where we crown a regular season champ, and that's the end of it. Let's have a playoff between the first place team and the second place team. Yeah. Or maybe the first place team plays the fourth place team, the second place team plays the third place team, and then the winners play off. It gives teams something to fight for. It gives fans something to keep their interest up. And concomitantly, some minor leagues divided the season into halves and had the first half winner play the second half winner, like baseball did in 1981, the great strike season. And that was Shaughnessy's idea. And then, of course, Larry McPhail, before he takes over the operation of the Cincinnati Reds, is a minor league executive in the Cardinals system, working in Columbus, Ohio. And he decides we can make going to a minor league game a thing all by itself. So he spruced up the park, he spruced up the ushers, he put in new seats, he brought in bands, he painted the park. He said, "This is an occasion," and he takes to night baseball as well, which helped to save the game.
Yeah.
Moving from those three, Rickey, Shaughnessy, and McPhail.
Three important names. From the Great Depression of the 30s to the war-torn decade of the 1940s, we have the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and almost immediately after that, baseball is thrust into a decision-making stage Do we keep the game going? Do we suspend operations? Commissioner Landis wrote the famous letter to President Roosevelt asking for his advice. And then in return, we have the green light letter, which we have here at the Baseball Hall of Fame. And this is where Landis is encouraged by FDR to basically keep baseball going. In looking at this story, doing your research, Steve, do you believe Landis was generally unsure what to do, or do you think he was simply searching for a confirmation of what he knew he wanted to do already?
I think he wanted some support from the president and wasn't quite sure what baseball should do. I love the green light letter and the story behind it. And the first part of the story is this: Landis hated Roosevelt, hated him. Roosevelt was a New Deal Democrat, obviously. Landis had been a progressive Republican. I mean, his one of his political supporters at the very beginning of his judicial career was Theodore Roosevelt. But as time went on, Roosevelt became a conservative Republican. He didn't like the New Deal. He didn't like the president. Clark Griffith, who owned the senators and knew the president, said something like, Landis wasn't more welcome at the White House than the Japanese ambassador. So for Landis to write to the president was, I think, an act that required some humility that the commissioner did not ordinarily possess. And yet, when he wrote to Roosevelt, now get this, he scribbled his note in pencil. It wasn't even typed. Is that an insult? Well, perhaps. And Landis says, Mr. President, what should we do? And the result is the green light letter. When it was, called the green light letter, not because it was written in green, but because it gave baseball the opportunity to play the 1942 season. Baseball hailed this letter. We can continue to operate. The Sporting News was in the habit already of presenting a Major League Player of the Year award at the end of the season. Someone suggests in January of 1942 that Roosevelt should be the Player of the Year for the 1942 season, even before a pitch had been thrown. But if you read the letter carefully, it's a permission slip, but not exactly. I mean, Roosevelt says, I honestly feel it would be best for the country to keep baseball going. But he also says, as to the players themselves, I know you agree that individual players who are of active military or naval age should go without question into the service. Well, it's great to have baseball, but who's going to play the game? And Roosevelt very deftly throws that question back to baseball's officialdom. And at the same time, Roosevelt gets in another dig and says, and by the way, since everybody's going to be working on the war effort, we need more games at night. And I'm not too sure that Landis thought that was a good idea either. Certainly Clark Griffith didn't in 1942, although he changed his tune within a couple of years because of all of the war work in and around Washington, D.C. The other thing about the green light letter, to kind of bring this story to a close, is that some people thought that it was carte blanche for the duration of the war, but it wasn't. It really gave baseball permission to play the 1942 season. But the same question, should we continue, came up before the 1943, the 1944, and the 1945 season. The 1945 season could have been canceled. It was really close until Washington officials came to believe that the war in Europe, at least, was coming to a close after the Battle of the Bulge. So it's not a question of green light. It's a question of a blinking yellow, I think, for the 4 seasons of the war. Yeah.
Steve, do you think Landis was hoping that FDR was going to give players an exemption so they wouldn't have to serve in the military? Do you think?
Yeah, I think that's the subtext. It would be really great if he would allow us to keep the players we have, and consider baseball to be a patriotic enterprise in support of the war effort. That, of course, did not happen. And many, many baseball players, as everyone knows, went into the service.
This might seem like a question with an obvious answer, but I'm going to throw it at you anyway. Do you think Landis and FDR made the right decision keeping the game going?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I suppose the answer should be, I would say yes. I guess certainly baseball players made a contribution. Some of them were on active duty. Some of them saw combat. Others had other military jobs in the military. Playing baseball, is that a military job? Well, they entertained the troops, and they were if things had gone poorly, could have been called to service on the front lines, I suppose. So yeah, I think it was the right thing. The effort in World War II was obviously total mobilization, but that doesn't mean that people can't relax from time to time and put a smile on their faces. And baseball did that. And even troops overseas were anxious for baseball news. The sporting news, long before I worked for it, put out an overseas edition that was sent around the world, and those copies were gobbled up. People read them over and over again. Baseball fans who were in the military craved news about what was happening in the American League and the National League. Absolutely.
Yeah. I agree. I think they did make the right decision. What's your hunch, Steve, on how good or bad the quality of play was in the absence of all the
quality of play was pretty bad.
Yeah.
The number of players, active major leaguers who played in 1941 and were not there in 1945, it's just enormous. And of course, the famous case is the St. Louis Browns, who in 1945 had Pete Gray on their roster, a man who had only one arm, and yet he played a complete major league season. He batted in the 220s, I think, which is not bad for a person with one arm, and he played the outfield fairly competently. Now, he had teammates who suggested that he was a liability, and of course he was a liability, but he was on the roster, and if the Browns had had a better alternative, I'm sure they would have promoted that alternative and demoted Gray to the minors. So that's I think an example of what the quality of play was like by the end of the war.
Interesting point. Let's talk about an aspect of baseball history that I don't know as much as I should know, and I think it's partly because it's received very little attention over the years, and that's the challenge that was posed by the Mexican League right after the war ended. This was around 1946. Mexican League president Jorge Pascal, a guy who had a huge amount of money, began to raid major league rosters for talent, starting with an outfielder named Danny Gardella. And then it continued with other players, Mickey Owens, Sal Magli, a couple of the names. What was Pascal's grand plan here? We know he was trying to improve the quality of play in the Mexican League, but was he also trying to maybe establish one or two of the Mexican League teams as an expansion team for the majors?
I think his stated goal was to turn the Mexican League into a third major league.
Third major league.
Yeah, pretty grandiose. Maybe going for expansion would have been a more realistic challenge. But he talked about making the Mexican League a third major league. It was a pipe dream, of course. He didn't have enough money for that. But as you said, he recruited, I think in 1946, 23 major leaguers to violate the terms of their contract because of the reserve clause and to come to Mexico. He offered them more money, much more money than they were making in the United States. And in fact, his offers to the stars, to Greenberg, to Bob Feller, to Stan Musial, to come south were exorbitant for the time, absolutely exorbitant. I think he offered Musial $50,000 just to sign a contract at a time when Musial was making probably $5,000 a year, maybe.
Wow.
Maybe, yeah. Stan turned him down, but others didn't, and it didn't pan out, of course. But it was a grandiose idea.
Gardella and the other players, I believe, played just one season in the Mexican League, and that was it. What happened?
Some played more than one season.
Oh, some
Gardella
did.
played only one season. You're correct. When these players signed contracts with Pascal, Commissioner Chandler banned them from organized baseball for 5 years. And when they came back to the United States after a season or two in Mexico and were not able to resume their position in organized baseball, join their old teams, one of the results was lawsuits. Gardella sued. Um, you're depriving me of a living, and it's baseball's antitrust exemption, if we call it that. That is the reason that I can't get my job back. Gardella sued. The case went to trial. He settled. He took money, settled, and dropped the lawsuit at a certain point. Chandler then reduced the ban to kind of time served, 3 years instead of 5, and eventually a number of those players rejoined their old clubs. But the Mexican League episode was a shot across the bow. I mean, it told Major League owners what they already knew, and that is that the reserve clause would not survive legal scrutiny.
Yeah. You mentioned the 5-year ban that was imposed by Happy Chandler. You think that was an overreaction on his part?
Yeah, I think it was. He was trying to use it as a deterrent, but sometimes the punishment is so strong that the people who are punished just get their dander up and really are not willing to compromise. Yeah, it was. Yes, I think it was an overreaction. Yeah, something less than that would have been more appropriate.
Yeah, I mean, a 5-year ban for a professional ball player is almost like a lifetime ban.
Right, that's exactly right. Yeah,
you're taking away so many prime years.
Mm-hmm.
But as it turned out, the players who did come back did not have to serve the 5 years. Gardella did not play again, correct?
Boy, he re-signed with the Cardinals eventually, and did he play like one game in the majors?
Really?
I'm not even sure about that. But he had been a Giant before jumping to Mexico, and then came back with the Cardinals, but not for very long. No.
Yeah.
He was a marginal player at best, not a star. But he was the fellow Pascal met in New York, and he explained to him the economics of the American baseball system. Pascal was amazed, I think.
Yeah. There's an interesting and also a tragic footnote to this story. In 1955, Pascal was killed in a plane crash. And then not long after, the Mexican League actually joins up with the National Association of Professional Baseball Leagues. They become part of the National Association, and that happens right after his death.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah. Sad story from his point of view. His family was very wealthy. They had a lot of money. He was an entrepreneur, a power broker involved in both business and politics, and I think he lived an interesting and exciting life.
Not surprisingly, you devote a good portion of the book to Branch Rickey. We talked about him a little bit earlier, his development of the farm system. Also, we need to, of course, talk about his decision to challenge the baseball establishment through integration. In signing Robinson, he signs him initially in the fall of 45, then brings him up 2 years later. How much do you think was Rickey motivated by morality, doing the right thing, versus how much he was motivated simply by improving his team, by adding the best black players available?
I think it's both. I think Rickey considered himself a Christian gentleman. I think he believed that Christian gentlemen should be capitalists, and in favor of democracy and what we would now call equal rights. And I think it all went hand in hand. I don't think he had to take off one hat and put on another hat to sign Jackie Robinson. I think it was all of a piece.
Yeah. One of the interesting things I learned in the book was about spring training for the Brooklyn Dodgers in 47, the year that Robinson joins them.
Yes.
They train in Havana, in Cuba.
Right.
And here's something I was not aware of. I don't know why, but the Dodgers had several other black players in that camp, including Roy Campanella and Don Newcomb. I was not aware of that. To me, this is brilliant by Rickey, not leaving Robinson alone, but essentially giving him some, I guess, other potential allies in the integration movement.
Right. Yes. Yeah. Rickey took the Dodgers to Havana in '47 because Robinson, of course, had been in spring training in Florida in '46 on the roster of the Montreal Royals and had had a pretty rough time in any number of cities that did not allow him to play and did not allow the Royals to play. Rickey thought Havana was more racially tolerant, which it was, and so he took both the Dodgers and the Royals to Havana and to Panama, in fact, for some games, for the entirety of spring training. The important thing, I think, to mention here, Bruce, something that people don't fully understand or recognize, is that Robinson was not a Dodger in spring training of 1947. He was on the roster of the Montreal Royals. So the Royals played the Dodgers in any number of games. Robinson played for the Royals, and it was Rickey's way to show the white Dodgers that there's this guy on the other team who is really, really good. You know, we're just not making a case for him. He can make a case for himself. The organization does not promote Robinson from the Montreal Royals to the Brooklyn Dodgers until spring training is over and they come back to New York and are ready to open the season. But in all those games, Robinson had played against the Dodgers, and so had Campanella and Newcomb, as a matter of fact.
Very interesting. It's not a subject that you really explore in the book, but I'm interested in your opinion on it. When you look at the relationship between Robinson and Rickey, there's no doubt that Robinson benefited Rickey. Rickey benefited from Robinson. So there was a mutual gain there. But on a personal level, do you think that Jackie Robinson liked Branch Rickey? Did he consider him a true friend?
I think so. I think so, yes. You know, Mrs. Robinson, Rachel, is still alive. And I think she speaks very highly of Branch Rickey, and always had. Did they socialize together? Well, you know, this is employer and employee, so maybe not. But I mean, certainly, you know, there they are, almost face to face in that middle photograph. Ben Chapman wouldn't shake Robinson's hands. He was afraid his, can I use this word, his Negro-ness would rub off. Rickey shook his hand, I'm sure. That's before the age when guys hugged each other a lot as we do now. But I think, you know, under the right circumstances, Rickey would have hugged Robinson, and vice versa with no problems. Yes, I think they were genuinely fond of each other. I think they each recognized that the other was the right person at the time, and that they both benefited from that relationship.
Yeah. One of the other great characters, and there are many that you explore in the book, but I've always been fascinated by Bill Veeck, Maverick owner. You can certainly make an argument that he is one of the most important, influential owners in Major League history, but he might have been at the top of the list when it came to doing colorful things, and his outgoing personality and his connection with the fans. This was really an owner. There was no one else like him at the time, was there?
No, not at all. First of all, he was not, you know, he didn't have a lot of money. He leveraged a lot of money to buy the Indians, his first major league team, put together an economic system, a stock debenture system that I can't begin to understand. But he was able to buy a major league team without investing a lot of his own cash because he didn't have a lot of his own cash. And took charge of the Indians, integrated them fairly quickly, you know, within months after Robinson integrated the National League, and won a pennant and a World Series in 1948. He was not only an owner, he was probably the greatest fan among the owners. I mean, he really loved baseball. He loved going to games. He loved sitting in the stands with other fans and buying a beer and having a good time. there are, I think, other owners who love baseball as much as he did. Bud Selig is certainly one. Whatever we think of him as commissioner, but Veeck was a fan, and I think he enjoyed his baseball experience immensely.
You mentioned that he never seemed to have much money, yet he found enough to become an owner several times over.
Several
That's pretty
times.
fascinating.
That's right. He bought the Indians, he bought the Browns, and he bought the White Sox twice. Incredible. Yeah.
A lot of loans, a lot of personal favors.
Putting together a syndicate, where lots of people own little pieces of the pie, but he was always as we would say now, the CEO. He was calling the shots.
Yeah. During the course of his long career and several stints as an owner, he brought us so many different promotions and innovations. What do you think was his greatest innovation for the game?
Well, we have to mention age, I suppose, first. It was an innovation for the American League, but he integrated the American League just months after Rickey and Robinson integrated the National League. Beyond that, I mean, there are just so many things that he tried. I mean, his understanding was that coming to see a baseball game is great, but coming to see a baseball game with some extra entertainment is also important, especially if your team is not very good. He was originally, as a youngster, an employee of the Chicago Cubs, and was responsible in part for growing the ivy on the walls and creating the concept that we still use today, beautiful Wrigley Field. You ask baseball fans, we don't say what teams have you seen play. We say what ballparks have you been to, and everybody says, well, I want to go to Fenway and I want to go to Wrigley Field, and in part that's because of Bill Veeck. Let's go to the ballpark and have a good time, regardless of what happens during the game.
Yeah. In retrospect, some of the things that he did, I guess, might be considered offensive today. Some would say, exploitation of Eddie Gaedel, although he did try to help Gaedel financially. Gaedel had a lot of personal and financial problems during his life.
Mm-hmm.
There was the short pants, which didn't work out too well. There was disco demolition, although that was, I guess, more Mike Veeck than probably Bill Veeck. Mike
right.
was the first to admit that. So there were some things that didn't work. On the other side, though, one of the things I think that, and I think you're right, integration of the American League is at the top of the list. Maybe second, though, the decision to have player names on the backs of jerseys, which is almost a foregone conclusion in today's game.
Yes, right. Just a few teams don't do that, including your Yankees. That innovation actually comes, after my book is over. Someone else can write that story. But yeah, I mean, Veeck was always interested in enhancing the fan experience. Let's modernize the concession stands. Let's sell more, a variety of items. Let's make the seats more comfortable and the sight lines better. Let's make sure that when people come here, they really enjoy themselves.
Some of them were just fun, like when he had people dress up as Martians.
Yeah, right.
And invade the ballpark. I mean, that was hysterical.
Yes, it is. So lots of things have, some of us remember an ice cream confection called an Eskimo pie, which is kind of like a ice cream on a stick without the stick, and it would be relatively easy, Veeck said, if you have a crowd of 10,000 people, to give everybody one Eskimo pie. But let's make it a little bit more fun. Let's give all 10,000 Eskimo pies to one person and see what happens then.
Yeah. We mentioned that you really start in the years of the Great Depression, and then you take us up to the early part of the 1960s. And here we see Major League Baseball had not seen any expansion throughout the 20th century. For so many years, we had the 16 teams, 8 in the American, 8 in the National League. Why do you think it took so long for baseball to move beyond 16 franchises?
Well, baseball owners were extremely conservative in almost every aspect of their business operation. But you're right that my book ends in 1960, really, the last season when each major league had had 8 teams. Um, uh, Owners were satisfied. They liked things the way they were. They didn't realize that the country was changing in a whole number of ways. Didn't realize that the population had been shifting. Didn't realize that people were moving out of the cities into the suburbs. Didn't realize that that there were cities that deserved, quote unquote, major league teams that were certainly big enough and strong enough and vibrant enough to support them. I mean, there's a story of Hank Greenberg, who after his playing career became an executive, suggesting expansion to the West Coast. And Clark Griffith, the owner of the Senators for nearly half a century, says to him, "Henry, don't go out there. It always rains on the Pacific Coast." And Greenberg, solicitous, says, "Well, Mr. Griffith," he says, "when's the last time you were out there?" And Clark Griffith says, "Well, I pitched out there in 1904. So there's your business strategy. Yeah.
Yeah. You do write in the book about the Continental League, which never really got off the ground, but it did play a huge role in catapulting baseball to expansion.
Yes, that's right. Again, this is a Rickey idea. I mean, he's hidden or not so hidden on almost every page of the book. But he's left the Cardinals, he's left the Dodgers, he's left the Pirates, but he's still a vibrant thinker and realizes, as I just said, that there were cities that were big enough to support major league teams: Houston, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Toronto, Atlanta, and conceives of a third major league. Let's challenge these 2 major leagues. Let's bring baseball to where the people are, and hatches a plan for the Continental League, which, of course, after the Dodgers and Giants moved to the West Coast, involves putting a team in New York City. The majors fumbled this. I mean, Andy McHugh has written a wonderful book called "Stumbling Around the Bases" about how the American League tried to, or mishandled, every expansion opportunity presented to it. But the Continental League never plays a game, but it forced the American League and the National League eventually to expand from 8 teams to 10, and then even more beyond that. A Rickey idea, of course.
I've heard you make the point that the National League and the American League, they did not work together on that initial expansion. They were kind of doing their own thing separately.
Oh, yeah. Oh, absolutely. The 2 leagues were separate operations. We think of this organization today called MLB, Major League Baseball. But the National League, the American League, were 2 separate operations. They had their own constitutions, their own presidents, their own executive committees. They did some things together, but in many ways they were competitors. And when it came to planning, if there was any planning, and there really wasn't a lot of it, they would do that independent of each other. Yeah.
And really, in retrospect, expansion made perfect sense. In 1961 and 62, we would see a second franchise in Los Angeles. It's a big enough market to support that. New York, certainly big enough market to support 2 teams. Houston, one of the biggest cities in the American South. And of course, the expansion team and franchise in Washington to replace the located Senators who went to Minnesota. Mm-hmm. So it was something that was probably overdue, but ultimately a good thing for the game. Our guest is Steve Gietschier, who has written this terrific new book, Baseball, the Turbulent Midcentury Years. We do have still a few minutes remaining with Steve. We'd like to take your questions for him. And we already have a few that have been posted in our chat room, so let's get to them. The first one comes from Vinny Giacinto. Vinny writes, "Who is the biggest name that comes to mind who was possibly on a Hall of Fame career path, but then went to war and never returned?"
Ooh.
It's a tough question, but we'll throw it your way anyway.
Yeah, maybe Cecil Travis, infielder.
Yeah.
I think he suffered frostbite, I believe, in Europe, and when he came back to play, the talent was gone. So that's certainly a possibility. Yeah.
Yeah, I've heard it said that he was diagnosed with what they called frozen feet,
Yeah.
frostbite,
Mm-hmm.
and never fully recovered.
Yeah.
So that, yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's probably a real good name right there.
Yeah. And he was a significant player. He was a star. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And of course,
Question.
others lost time, and so and even if they were prominent players like Musial and Williams and Feller, their career numbers would be much better, much higher if even though we recognize them as greats, if they hadn't lost time because of the war.
I think in general, and maybe you agree, that we give these players war credit. You know, Ted Williams missing 4 1/4 seasons, Feller missing multiple seasons. Yeah, they were Hall of Famers even without those years. But I think in a lot of ways, we kind of say, hey, they deserve to maybe have imaginary numbers tacked on. Their
Yeah,
legacies become even greater. Do you
yeah,
agree?
I think so. Sure. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Question from Stan Okenka. Although first a comment, great history lesson, Steve. In the book, you have a lot of financial information on the major league teams. Was compiling this data hard to research?
Um, Not really. Baseball was subject to a congressional investigation in 1951. The House of Representatives Judiciary Committee Subcommittee on Monopoly conducted hearings into baseball and demanded the documents. The transcripts of those hearings with the documents run to almost 2,000 pages. Researching isn't hard. And digging through that stuff is what's hard. But there's an enormous amount of financial information in that volume and in the 250-page report that was published about a year later. This was data that I'm sure baseball did not want to give up, but they were under congressional subpoena, and they obeyed.
Our next one is more of a comment than a question, but I think it should be mentioned. Ted Knorr, who is one of our faithful followers, writes, I wonder if there is a young person in the audience today who might be a Steve Gietschier of the future, a continuation of the Seymour Gietschier narrative. Ted doesn't ask the question, but maybe I will. When you look at young researchers and writers today, any names that come to mind? Any writers, young writers that you like to follow when you see that they have a new book out? You really take interest in it?
Well, one of the books I'm looking forward to will come out from the Nebraska Press in next spring. It's a biography of Harry Dalton, long-term general manager of the Brewers, the Orioles, and the Angels, by a young scholar named Lee Cluck. I don't know if Lee has another book in him, but I'm certainly looking forward to that one. On the other hand, having spent 23 years on my book, I don't think I'd burden anybody else by saying you should write the next one.
Yeah. I'm curious, when you were at the Sporting News and you were the editor, I don't know that you necessarily had much face-to-face contact with some of the writers there, but there were a lot of great baseball writers that contributed weekly columns to the Sporting News over the years. Some of them predated you. I'm thinking of people like, Dick Young. He would regularly write for the Sporting News. Wells Twombly, who was a Bay Area writer. Anybody that, when you were there in the 80s and 90s, any of the writers that, while you may not worked in the same office with them, you perhaps got to know a little bit?
Well, actually, the one fellow whose columns were no longer appearing in the Sporting News by the time I got there in 1986, who I got to know later, was Leonard Coppin.
Yeah.
Who wrote for the New York Post, the New York Times, and then retired to write. Well, semi-retired to move to San Francisco. Through another organization, I got to know Leonard pretty well. I think the only person I've ever met who was born in Moscow, and he was analytical. He was perceptive. He was articulate. He knew baseball. He knew pro basketball as well, and anybody who read Leonard knows that they profited from that experience. Just an awesome personality.
I had the pleasure of meeting him during some Hall of Fame Veterans Committee elections. He served on that committee for many years. He was the perfect combination of high intelligence, but a down-home fan. He had both those qualities.
Yeah, he wrote a book on baseball managers and set up a system for kind of analyzing them and just, who was a disciple of Connie Mack, who was a disciple of John McGraw, who was a disciple of Branch Rickey. And at that time, before I met him, I was reviewing books for the Sporting News, and I reviewed that book, and I gave it a very positive review. And then a few months later, I met him, and the first thing he said was, "You understood what I was trying to do. Thank you so much." Well, there you go.
That's great.
And we became friends.
One more comment to pass along, and I think this is from someone you know. Her name is Christine Gietschier.
Oh, yeah.
So she says, "My brother's baseball knowledge never ceases to amaze me. I'm very proud of him, especially for writing this book." Very nice, Christine.
Well, thanks, Chris. The check is in the mail. Yeah.
Yeah. Is Christine a big baseball fan?
She is. Yes. She's a Mets fan like I am. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, and is she in St. Louis too?
No, she lives on Long Island.
Mm-hmm. All right. Very good. Well, thanks, Christine, for checking in. We appreciate her comment, all the other comments as well. Steve, as we get set to wrap up our conversation here on Virtual Author Series, how is the book doing? I know the public reaction, the critical praise has been there, but are you also pretty happy with, in terms of, the number of sales and how many people are getting to see the book?
Well, I hope so. I've gotten one royalty check already. It's a little hard to track sales. As you know, Bruce, it's a very, very complicated business.
Yeah.
And I can't begin to understand it. But I think so. Everybody who's mentioned it to me has done so favorably. I think people who don't like it have been very kind in not saying it to my face. So we'll see. I think it's selling pretty well. The press has a sale on right now.
Yeah.
Anybody who wants a signed copy can get a hold of me directly, and I'll be glad to inscribe a copy and send it to them.
How can people do that?
Well, my email address, I guess, is look at my last name. It's sgietsch. That's SGIETSCH. sgietsch@gmail.com.
So SGIETSCH at gmail.com.
At gmail.com, yeah.
And that is the best way to purchase a signed copy from you. It would also be available at the University of Nebraska Press website, of course, Amazon. Do you pay a lot of attention to the reviews at Amazon?
There are right now 2 reviews at Amazon, and they are both extraordinarily favorable, and I treasure them both. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm sure that more will come in. It's a great book. It has gotten a lot of praise in the baseball community from terrific sources, other authors, and when other authors endorse your work, that's pretty high praise.
Yes, it is. The highest praise, I think, is that people are willing to read it. When you think about it, Bruce, writing a book is an act of arrogance. It's one thing to have a thought in your head. It's another thing to say, this thought is so important that I should put it down on paper and ask other people to read it.
Yeah.
And when other people actually do that, that's extraordinary. It's absolutely extraordinary. And I treasure every reader for that reason alone.
There's nothing better than when you hear from a reader, and it doesn't have to be a famous person. It could just be a fan all the way across the country. And they tell you, yeah, I really enjoyed what you wrote. I mean, that's almost better than royalty checks.
Yeah, really. Mm-hmm.
The book, Baseball, The Turbulent Midcentury Years by Steve Gietschier, formerly the managing editor of the Sporting News, and also someone who has worked at the university level, now enjoying, we're going to call it semi-retirement in St. Louis. Steve, best of luck with the book, and best of luck on any future projects you might be planning.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce. I've enjoyed this very much. Thanks for the invitation, and thank you to everybody for sitting through this past hour.
Well, Steve, you're very gracious. We appreciate you joining us on a beautiful fall day virtually here in Cooperstown. Again, our guest, Stephen Gietschier, a virtual author series, a writer of a terrific new book, Baseball, The Turbulent Mid-Century Years. We thank Steve. We thank our producer, Addie Brundage. And of course, we thank all of you for joining us and participating in our virtual author series. Thanks for being with us. Have a great day, everybody.